The morning sun rose over Ouagadougou, casting golden light across the sprawling capital of Burkina Faso. The city was already stirring to life, with vendors setting up their stalls at the Grand Marché, motorbikes weaving through unpaved streets, and the faithful making their way to early prayers. In the northern district of Ouagadougou, where modest concrete homes stood shoulder to shoulder along dusty roads, an elderly woman named Aminata Konate swept her courtyard with the same deliberate care she had practiced for over 60 years. Aminata paused, leaning on her broom handle, and squinted at the building across the narrow street. It was a 3-story apartment complex, newer than most structures in the neighborhood, with fresh paint that had only begun to fade under the relentless Sahelian sun. The building housed 12 families, workers mostly, people who rose before dawn and returned after dusk, their lives measured in hard-earned francs and the hope that tomorrow might bring something better than today. But something was wrong with that building. Aminata had noticed it 3 days ago, though she could not quite articulate what troubled her. She was a woman who had lived through coups and droughts, who had raised 7 children and buried a husband, and her instincts had been honed by decades of survival. The building simply felt wrong. She called to her grandson, Issouf, a lean young man of 19 who helped her with errands between his studies at the Technical Institute. He emerged from the house, pulling on a faded football jersey, his eyes still heavy with sleep. "Grandmother, it is not even 6 in the morning," Issouf said, though without complaint. He loved his grandmother deeply and knew that when she called, it was important. "Look at that building, child," Aminata said, pointing with her broom. "Tell me what you see." Issouf followed her gesture, studying the apartment complex with the drowsy attention of youth. "I see a building, grandmother. The one where Musa, the taxi driver, lives with his family." "Look more carefully," Aminata insisted. "The roof, what lands on the roof," Issouf observed for a long moment, and gradually, understanding crept into his expression. The rooftops throughout Ouagadougou were typically occupied by birds, especially in the early morning. Pigeons, sparrows, and the occasional crow would gather on the flat surfaces, cooing and calling as the day began. Yet the roof of the apartment building stood eerily empty. Not a single bird perched there, despite the abundance of avian life on every surrounding structure. "There are no birds," Issouf said slowly. "I had not noticed, but you are right, grandmother. No birds land there. For 3 days now I have watched," Aminata said. "Birds fly toward it, then veer away. Something warns them off. Birds know things we do not. Issouf. They sense danger that human eyes cannot see." Issouf considered this, his young mind torn between modern education and traditional wisdom. Perhaps the building is too new. Perhaps the birds have not grown accustomed to it yet. "The building has stood for 8 months, Aminata counted. "Long enough for birds to claim it, but they will not. Something is wrong, and I fear for the families inside." The conviction in her voice gave Issouf pause. His grandmother was not prone to superstition, despite her respect for old ways. When she spoke with such certainty, experience had taught him to listen. "What would you have me do, grandmother?" "We must tell someone," Aminata said. "Someone who will listen, someone who cares about people like us." Issouf thought carefully. In Burkina Faso, especially in the neighborhoods like Ouagadougou, the gap between citizens and authority could seem vast. But recent years had brought changes. The young captain who now led their country, Ibrahim Traoré, had made himself more accessible than previous leaders. He had walked through markets, visited rural villages, and encouraged citizens to bring their concerns directly to regional offices established for that purpose. "There is a community liaison office near the central market," Issouf said. "The president's administration set it up so ordinary people could report issues directly. I could go there this morning, before my classes." Aminata nodded, satisfied. "Yes, tell them what we have observed. If I'm wrong, they will think an old woman foolish. But if I am right and we say nothing, blood will be on our hands." The weight of her words settled on Issouf's shoulders. He glanced again at the apartment building, watching as the morning light strengthened and birds continued to avoid the structure entirely, as if an invisible barrier surrounded it. A chill ran through him, despite the growing heat of the day. "I will go now," he said. Chapter 2. The Community Liaison Office occupied a small building that had once been a pharmacy, located on a side street near the Grand Marché. Issouf arrived just as the office was opening, joining a handful of other citizens waiting outside. The group included a woman holding a crying infant, an elderly man with a land dispute to report, and two farmers whose irrigation system had failed. When Issouf's turn came, he was directed to a desk where a young man named Bakari, perhaps only a few years older than Issouf himself, sat with a notebook and pen. Bakari wore the efficient expression of someone who had heard countless complaints and understood that each one, no matter how small it seemed, might matter to someone. "Good morning, brother," Bakari said. "How can we help you today?" Issouf hesitated, suddenly aware of how strange his report would sound. "My grandmother has noticed something unusual in our neighborhood. In Bogodogo, there is an apartment building, and for 3 days no birds have landed on its roof. She believes something is wrong with the structure." Bakari's pen paused above his notebook. "No birds on the roof." "None," Issouf confirmed. "Every other building in the area has birds, but this one, they avoid it completely. My grandmother says birds sense dangers that humans cannot see. She fears for the families living inside." To Issouf's relief, Bakari did not dismiss the concern. Instead, he leaned forward with genuine interest. "Your grandmother's observation may be more important than you realize. Animals often detect structural instabilities or gas leaks before humans do. Captain Traoré himself has emphasized that we must take all safety reports seriously, especially those concerning residential buildings." Bakari asked for the exact location of the building, the number of families residing there, and any other details Issouf could provide. He wrote everything down carefully, then stamped the report with an official seal. "This will be forwarded to the Municipal Safety Office today," Bakari said. "Someone should investigate within 48 hours. Can you provide a contact number where you can be reached?" Issouf gave his grandmother's neighbor's phone number, as Aminata herself had no mobile phone. He felt both relieved and anxious as he left the office. He had done what he could, but would anyone truly take his grandmother's observations seriously? Would they understand that sometimes wisdom came not from degrees and diplomas, but from a lifetime of watching the world closely? Unknown to Issouf, his report had been filed at a particularly significant moment. Captain Ibrahim Traoré had recently issued a directive to all government departments, insisting that citizen reports be escalated quickly, especially those involving potential dangers to civilian life. The young president had grown frustrated with bureaucratic delays that sometimes turned minor problems into major disasters. By noon that same day, Issouf's report had reached the desk of Colonel Sankara, the regional safety coordinator. Sankara was a career military officer who had served alongside Traoré during the difficult years fighting insurgencies in the north. He had learned from Traoré that protecting civilians meant taking every threat seriously, no matter how unconventional the warning might seem. Sankara read the report 3 times, his brow furrowing, birds refusing to land on a roof. It was not the kind of technical assessment he was accustomed to reviewing, but he had seen enough in his years to know that nature often provided warnings that instruments and inspectors missed. He had once seen goats refuse to enter a field where an unexploded mine was buried, saving lives. He had watched birds flee an area hours before a major storm struck. He picked up his phone and called the municipal building inspector's office. "This is Colonel Sankara. I am forwarding you a report that requires immediate investigation. An apartment building in Bogodogo. Birds will not land on the roof. I want a full structural assessment by tomorrow morning." The building inspector, a man named Ouedraogo, received the order with some confusion, but knew better than to question a colonel. "Yes, sir. We will send a team this afternoon." "Not a team," Sankara corrected. "I want your most experienced inspector, and I want it treated as priority. If there is a structural issue and that building comes down with families inside, it will not be acceptable." "Understood, Colonel." Sankara hung up and made one more call, this time to Traoré's office at the presidential palace. He spoke briefly with an aide, explaining the situation and his decision to escalate the investigation. The aide promised to include it in the president's evening briefing. That evening, as the sun set over Ouagadougou and the call to prayer echoed from minarets across the city, Ibrahim Traoré sat in his modest office, reviewing the day's reports. He had spent the afternoon in meetings discussing security operations in the north and economic cooperation with Mali and Niger. Now, in these quiet hours, he reviewed the hundreds of small details that collectively determined whether his government served its people well or poorly. When he reached Sankara's note about the apartment building and the absent birds, Traoré paused. He reread the details, his sharp mind considering the implications. A younger leader might have dismissed it as superstition, but Traoré had grown up in Kera, in rural Burkina Faso, where people maintained close relationships with the natural world. He had seen his own grandmother read weather patterns in the behavior of ants, predict droughts by watching how trees shed their leaves. He picked up his secure phone and called Sankara directly. "Colonel, I read your report about the building in Bogodogo. The birds." "Yes, Captain. I have ordered an inspection for tomorrow. I want you to evacuate the building tonight," Traoré said quietly. "Before the inspection." There was a pause. "Captain, that will cause significant disruption to 12 families. If we evacuate and find nothing wrong, then we will apologize and help them return to their homes," Traoré interrupted. "But if something is wrong and we wait and people die because we did not take an old woman's wisdom seriously, that is a failure we cannot accept. Evacuate them tonight, Colonel. Find them temporary housing. I will authorize the funds personally." "Yes, Captain. It will be done." Chapter 3. Colonel Sankara arrived in Bogodogo as the evening call to prayer faded into twilight. He brought with him a detail of 6 soldiers, not for enforcement but for assistance, and had contacted local community leaders to help communicate with the building's residents. He knew that forced evacuation could cause panic and resentment, so he approached the task with care and respect. Aminata Konate watched from her courtyard as the military vehicles pulled up in front of the apartment building. Her heart raced with anxiety. Had she caused this? Had her concerns set something irreversible in motion? Issouf stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder. "You did what was right, grandmother," he said quietly. "Whatever happens now, you tried to protect people." Sankara stepped out of the lead vehicle and immediately sought out the community elder, a respected man named Diallo, who served as an informal mediator in the neighborhood. They spoke quietly for several minutes, Sankara explaining the situation and the president's direct order. Diallo listened carefully, then nodded his understanding. Together, they approached the apartment building and began knocking on doors. The residents emerged confused and concerned. Among them was Musa, the taxi driver Aminata had mentioned, his wife Fatima, and their 3 young children. There was also a family of 6 from the Fulani community, several students from the university, and a widow who sold fabric in the market. Sankara addressed them as a group, standing in the courtyard area between buildings. "I am Colonel Sankara, Regional Safety Coordinator. We have received a credible report of a potential structural issue with this building. As a precautionary measure, President Traoré has personally ordered a temporary evacuation while we conduct a thorough inspection. We have arranged temporary accommodation for all families at the government guest facility near the military base. You will be returned to your homes as soon as the building is cleared safe." "What kind of structural issue?" Musa demanded. "This building was only completed 8 months ago. It passed all inspections. We do not yet know if there is any issue," Sankara replied honestly. "But we have observed unusual signs that warrant investigation. It is better to be cautious than to take risks with your safety." "What unusual signs?" Fatima asked, holding her youngest child close. Before Sankara could answer, Aminata stepped forward from across the street. The crowd turned to look at the elderly woman, and several residents recognized her as a long-time neighbor. "It was my observation that prompted this," Aminata said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "For 3 days, I have watched, and no birds will land on your roof. Every other building, birds come and go, but yours, they avoid. Birds know things we do not. They sense what we cannot see. I reported this because I feared for your safety." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some faces showed skepticism, others showed concern. The widow who sold fabric spoke up. "I have noticed the same thing. I thought it strange but said nothing. And there is something else. At night, sometimes I hear creaking sounds in the walls. I thought perhaps it was the building settling, but it has not stopped." Others began sharing small observations they had dismissed. A student mentioned that his room always felt strangely warm, even at night. Another family reported hairline cracks appearing in their ceiling over the past week, cracks they had planned to repair themselves. Individually, these signs had seemed minor. Together, they painted a concerning picture. Sankara listened carefully to each report. his expression growing more serious. These observations confirm that evacuation is the correct decision. Please gather essential items only. My men will help you carry what you need. The inspection will begin first thing tomorrow morning, and we will have answers quickly. The evacuation proceeded with surprising cooperation. The soldiers helped carry belongings and children. Community members who were not affected offered assistance, bringing water and food for the displaced families. Within 2 hours, the building stood empty, its windows dark, its roof still avoiding the attention of any bird. Traoré received a call from Sankara confirming the successful evacuation. "Captain, all families are safely relocated. The building is empty." I must admit, once I began speaking with residents, several mentioned other concerning signs: cracks, unusual sounds, temperature anomalies. The old woman's observation about the birds may have been the first warning of something serious. "Good work, Colonel," Traoré said. "Ensure the inspector begins work at first light. I want to know what, if anything, those birds are sensing." That night, Aminata could not sleep. She sat in her courtyard under the stars, watching the empty building across the street. Issouf sat with her, neither speaking much, both consumed by the same questions. Had they done the right thing? Were they heroes or alarmists? Only tomorrow would tell. In the presidential residence, Traoré also found sleep difficult. He thought about the 12 families now sleeping in unfamiliar beds, displaced by his order, based on the observations of an elderly woman about bird behavior. If the inspection found nothing, he would face criticism for wasting resources and causing unnecessary disruption. But that risk seemed small compared to the alternative. He had learned long ago, during his years fighting in the north, that leadership meant making difficult decisions with incomplete information. Sometimes you had to trust instincts, trust wisdom that came from sources others might dismiss. His own grandmother had taught him that the natural world spoke to those who knew how to listen. He had chosen to listen. Now they would all wait for morning and learn what secrets, if any, the building held. Chapter 4. The inspection team arrived at dawn, led by Chief Inspector Ouedraogo, a man who had been assessing buildings for 23 years. He brought with him 2 assistants, structural analysis equipment, and a healthy skepticism about birds as building inspectors. However, he also brought professionalism and thoroughness. Colonel Sankara's tone on the phone had made clear that this was not routine, and Ouedraogo's reputation had been built on finding problems others missed. They began with the foundation, working methodically around the building's perimeter. Ouedraogo noted everything in his detailed report: soil conditions, drainage patterns, the quality of the concrete work. The building appeared sound at first examination, which did not surprise him. It was relatively new, built during the recent construction boom in Ouagadougou. But as they moved to the interior structure, things began to change. On the second floor, Ouedraogo noticed something unusual in the support columns. He ran his hand along the concrete, feeling for irregularities, then took out a specialized hammer designed to test concrete density. He tapped methodically, listening to the sound the material made. His expression darkened. "Bring me the ultrasonic scanner," he told his assistant. The scanner used sound waves to assess the internal structure of concrete. What it revealed made Ouedraogo's blood run cold. The support columns, which should have been solid concrete, reinforced with steel rebars, were partially hollow. In several places, large voids existed within the columns, weaknesses that severely compromised their load-bearing capacity. "How is this possible?" his younger assistant asked, staring at the scanner's display. "This building passed final inspection 8 months ago." Ouedraogo's jaw tightened. "Corruption is how it is possible. Someone took shortcuts, used less concrete and less steel than the specifications required, pocketed the difference, and bribed the inspector to sign off. This building should never have been certified safe for occupation." They continued the assessment, and the findings grew worse. The third-floor support structure was even more compromised. The roof, which appeared solid, was actually bearing its weight on columns that could fail at any moment. The building was not yet in immediate collapse danger, but it was deteriorating rapidly. The heat, the daily stress of occupants moving through the structure, the weight of the roof under the intense sun, all of it was putting pressure on supports that were fatally weakened. Ouedraogo immediately called Colonel Sankara. "Colonel, you need to hear this. The building is severely compromised. The support columns have large internal voids. Whoever built this structure took criminal shortcuts. If those families had remained inside, and if we had not evacuated them, this building could have collapsed within days or weeks, possibly sooner. Sankara felt ice run through his veins. Are you certain? Completely certain. I am surprised it has stood this long. The birds knew, Colonel. I do not know how, but they knew. Vibrations, perhaps, or subtle movements human senses cannot detect. But they knew this structure was dangerous, and they stayed away. That old woman saved 12 families. Sankara immediately called Traoré. The president listened to the report in silence, his mind processing the implications. A disaster had been averted, but only by the smallest margin. Without Aminata's observations, without Issouf's report, without the chain of people who took the concern seriously, 12 families would still be living in that building. They might have been eating breakfast or sleeping when the columns finally gave way and the structure came down. Colonel, I want everyone involved in the original construction and inspection of that building identified and arrested, Traoré said, his voice hard. This is criminal negligence. People could have died, nearly did die, and I want the media informed. I want every citizen of Burkina Faso to know that we take building safety seriously and that corruption in construction will be punished with the full force of law. Yes, Captain. And what about the families? The building is a total loss. The government will compensate them, Traoré decided. It is not their fault they trusted a building that should never have been certified. We will help them find new housing. And Colonel, I want to meet the woman who reported this. The grandmother, what was her name? Aminata Konate, Captain. Arrange for her to come to the palace tomorrow. Her and the grandson who filed the report. I want to thank them personally. By midday, word had spread through Bogodogo like wildfire. The building that had been evacuated was dangerous, criminally constructed, a disaster waiting to happen. Aminata's neighbors approached her with new respect, some apologizing for their initial skepticism. The families who had been evacuated, initially resistant and annoyed, now understood they had been saved. Musa, the taxi driver, brought his entire family to Aminata's courtyard. His wife Fatima was crying as she embraced the elderly woman. You saved our children, Fatima said. You saved all of us. How can we ever thank you? Aminata, uncomfortable with the attention, shook her head. I only watched and reported what I saw. Thank the birds. Thank the president for listening. Thank everyone who took action. But Issouf, watching his grandmother's humility, felt enormous pride. In a country often criticized for corruption and inefficiency, the system had worked. A citizen had reported a concern, the government had responded, and lives had been saved. It was a small victory, perhaps, but it felt significant. That evening, the story appeared on national television. The news broadcast showed footage of the evacuated building and interviewed Chief Inspector Ouedraogo, who explained the dangerous structural flaws that had been discovered. The anchor noted that the president himself had ordered the evacuation based on a citizen report about unusual bird behavior. The story resonated across Burkina Faso. In villages and cities, people discussed how traditional knowledge about animal behavior had combined with modern government responsiveness to prevent tragedy. Social media buzzed with commentary, some mocking the idea of birds as structural inspectors, others praising the wisdom of listening to careful observation regardless of its source. Chapter 5. The next morning, Aminata woke to find a government car waiting outside her home. She had been told to expect transportation to meet President Traoré, but seeing the official vehicle in her modest neighborhood made the entire situation feel surreal. She wore her best traditional dress, a beautiful boubou in deep blue fabric with gold embroidery, and covered her hair with a matching wrap. Issouf, nervous and excited, wore a pressed shirt and his cleanest trousers. The drive to the presidential palace took them through parts of Ouagadougou that Aminata rarely visited. The city was a study in contrasts, modern buildings rising near traditional compounds, paved roads giving way to packed dirt, wealthy neighborhoods bordered by humble districts. The palace itself was modest by presidential standards, reflecting Burkina Faso's practical approach to government buildings. They were escorted through security and into a reception area where Colonel Sankara greeted them warmly. Madame Konate, it is an honor to meet you. Your observations prevented a catastrophe. The president is eager to meet you both. Aminata and Issouf were led to a meeting room where Ibrahim Traoré waited. The president stood as they entered, immediately putting them at ease with his warm handshake and genuine smile. At 37, Traoré carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned his position through service rather than privilege. He wore his military uniform simply, without excessive decoration. "Madame Konaté," Traoré said, "thank you for coming. Please, sit. I wanted to meet you personally, and thank you for your service to your fellow citizens." Aminata, despite her nervousness, met his eyes steadily. "Captain, I only reported what I observed. Any grandmother in Burkina Faso would have done the same." "But you were the one who did it," Traoré replied. "You watched carefully, you trusted your instincts, and you took action. That is exactly the kind of citizenship our country needs. And Issouf, thank you for taking your grandmother's concerns seriously and filing the report. I have learned to listen to my grandmother, Captain," Issouf said with a slight smile. "She is usually right about things." Traoré laughed. "Wisdom like hers is rare and valuable. I want to hear, in your own words, what you observed and why you felt it was important to report." Aminata described her 3 days of watching, explaining how she had noticed the absence of birds and understood it as a warning. She spoke about growing up in a village where people paid attention to animal behavior because it often signaled changes in weather, soil conditions, or hidden dangers. She talked about the responsibility she felt toward her neighbors, the families with children who lived in that building. Traoré listened intently, occasionally asking questions. When she finished, he nodded thoughtfully. "What you are describing is traditional ecological knowledge. It is something we are in danger of losing as we modernize. We build cities and schools and forget the wisdom that kept our ancestors alive for thousands of years. Your report reminds us that modern technology and traditional wisdom should work together, not compete." He turned to Sankara. "Colonel, I want a directive sent to all government safety offices. From now on, reports based on environmental observations, animal behavior, unusual sounds, changes in water or soil should be treated as seriously as technical reports. We should train our inspectors to recognize and value these kinds of warnings." "An excellent idea, Captain," Sankara agreed. "We could even develop partnerships with community elders who have this kind of knowledge." Traoré turned back to Aminata and Issouf. "I have a request to make of both of you. The government has authorized compensation for the families who lost their homes in the evacuated building. We are also investigating the corruption that led to the faulty construction. But I would like you, Madame Konaté, to serve as a community safety advisor for your district. Your job would be to observe and report anything unusual, and to teach others what to watch for. We would provide a small stipend for your time." Aminata's eyes widened. "Captain, I am 73 years old. I have no education beyond primary school." "You have something far more valuable than credentials," Traoré replied. "You have wisdom, attention to detail, and the courage to speak up when you see something wrong. Those qualities are exactly what we need." Aminata looked at Issouf, who nodded encouragingly. She turned back to Traoré. "If you believe I can be of service, Captain, then I accept." "Excellent. And Issouf, I understand you are studying at the Technical Institute. What is your field?" "Civil engineering, Captain. I want to design buildings that help Burkina Faso grow stronger. Then I have a proposal for you as well. Once you complete your studies, I would like to offer you a position in the Government Building Safety Office. We need young engineers who understand both modern construction principles and traditional wisdom. You would work alongside inspectors like Ouedraogo, helping ensure that every building in our country is safe." Issouf could barely speak. "Captain, that would be an incredible honor." "Yes, I accept." Traoré stood and shook hands with both of them. "Then we have an agreement. Madame Konaté will help protect her community, and Issouf will help ensure that what happened with that apartment building never happens again. This is how we build a better Burkina Faso, by valuing every citizen's contribution and combining all forms of knowledge." As they prepared to leave, Traoré had one more surprise. "And before you go, there is a press conference in 30 minutes. I would like you both to stand with me while I discuss what happened and announce the new safety initiatives. The country should see the faces of the people who made a difference." Chapter 6. The press conference was held in the palace courtyard, with journalists from across Burkina Faso and several international outlets in attendance. Aminata and Issouf stood to the side as Traoré addressed the assembled media, explaining the situation with the apartment building and the broader implications for public safety. 3 days ago, an elderly woman in Bogodogo noticed something unusual, Traoré began. Birds refused to land on the roof of an apartment building in her neighborhood. She could have dismissed this observation as meaningless. Instead, she recognized it as a warning, and she had the courage to report it. Her grandson took her concerns seriously and filed an official report. Because of this chain of responsible citizenship, 12 families are alive today. He paused, letting the significance sink in. The inspection of that building revealed criminal negligence in its construction. Support columns that should have been solid concrete were partially hollow. The structure was in danger of collapse. Without the evacuation we ordered based on Madame Konaté's observations, we could have faced a tragedy. Traoré gestured to Aminata and Issouf. I have asked Madame Aminata Konaté and her grandson Issouf to join me today because they represent something important about Burkina Faso. We are a nation that values both progress and tradition, both education and wisdom, both individual initiative and community responsibility. When we combine these strengths, we are unstoppable. A journalist raised her hand. Captain, some have questioned whether evacuating a building based on bird behavior was an overreaction. How do you respond to that criticism? I respond by saying those 12 families are alive and unharmed, Traoré replied firmly. If we had waited for a conventional inspection to be scheduled through normal bureaucratic channels, people might have died. When citizen safety is at stake, I would rather act on incomplete information and be proven wrong than wait for perfect certainty and be proven right by corpses in rubble. That is not the kind of leadership Burkina Faso deserves. Another journalist asked about the corruption investigation. Traoré's expression hardened. We have identified the construction company responsible and the inspector who falsified the safety certification. Both will face prosecution. This is not just about one building. This is about holding people accountable when they put profit above human life. We are also conducting reviews of all buildings constructed by this company in the past 5 years. Any that show similar defects will be evacuated and remediated or demolished. He continued. I am also announcing new initiatives based on what we learned from this incident. First, we are establishing a network of community safety advisors. People like Madame Konaté who will be trained to observe and report potential dangers in their neighborhoods. Second, we are incorporating traditional ecological knowledge into our safety inspector training programs. Third, we are creating a rapid response protocol for citizen safety reports, ensuring that concerns raised by any Burkinabe citizen receive timely investigation. The questions continued for another 20 minutes, with Traoré patiently explaining his reasoning and vision. When the conference concluded, several journalists approached Aminata directly, asking for her perspective. Initially shy, she grew more confident as she explained her observations and her belief that nature provides warnings to those who pay attention. One journalist, a woman from a regional television station, asked Aminata what message she would give to other citizens. Aminata thought carefully before responding. I would say, trust what you see, trust what you know. If something feels wrong, speak up. We are all responsible for each other's safety. The president and his government cannot be everywhere. We must be the eyes and ears of our communities. And I would say, listen to the old ways. Our ancestors survived for thousands of years by reading signs in nature. That knowledge is not superstition. It is science that predates laboratories. The interview clip would be replayed on television stations across West Africa, making Aminata briefly famous as the grandmother who saved 12 families by watching birds. If you're enjoying this story, consider subscribing to the channel so we can continue bringing you more content like this. Chapter 7. The investigation into the apartment building's construction moved swiftly. Within a week, authorities had arrested the owner of the construction company, Séverin Caboret, a wealthy businessman with connections to the previous government. They also detained the building inspector who had falsely certified the structure as safe, a man named Lamoussa Traoré, no relation to the president, who had accepted a substantial bribe. The evidence was overwhelming. Financial records showed Caboret had purchased less than half the concrete and steel specified in the building plans, pocketing the difference. Construction site photos, obtained from workers willing to testify, showed the hollow support columns during construction. Lamoussa Traoré's bank accounts revealed deposits that coincided with his inspection approvals, but the investigation revealed something more disturbing. The apartment building in Bogodogo was not an isolated case. Traoré's company had built 17 structures in Ouagadougou over the past 5 years, including 2 schools, a medical clinic, and 14 residential buildings. If the same corner cutting occurred in these other structures, thousands of people could be at risk. President Traoré convened an emergency meeting with his security and infrastructure advisors. "We need to inspect every building this company constructed," he said without preamble. "Every single one. Schools first, then medical facilities, then residential structures. We cannot allow another day to pass with children studying or people sleeping in buildings that might collapse." His Minister of Infrastructure, a competent woman named Rasmane Ouedraogo, nodded. "So, Captain, I have already mobilized every qualified inspector in Ouagadougou and requested additional support from Bobo Dioulasso. We can complete assessments of the schools and clinic within 3 days. Residential buildings will take longer." 3 days is too long for the schools," Traoré said. "We close them tomorrow. Every school built by Traoré's company, we close immediately. We cannot gamble with children's lives." "The parents will be upset," one advisor cautioned. "Closing schools will disrupt education and create hardship for families who depend on school meal programs." "Then we set up temporary facilities," Traoré replied. "We use community centers, churches, mosques, whatever spaces we can access quickly, and we ensure the meal programs continue. But we do not keep children in buildings that might be death traps. This is not negotiable." The school closures were announced that evening, causing exactly the disruption the advisor had predicted. Parents were angry and confused. Teachers worried about their jobs. Students celebrated the unexpected break. But the government moved quickly to establish alternative arrangements, and within 48 hours, temporary classroom spaces were functioning across the affected areas. The inspections confirmed everyone's worst fears. Both schools showed the same pattern of hollow support columns and substandard materials. One school, serving 300 children, had support structures so compromised that the chief inspector declared it could have collapsed during the next heavy rain, when the added weight of water on the roof would have exceeded the weakened columns. Capacity. The medical clinic was even worse, serving a neighborhood of 15,000 people. The facility had been operating for 3 years. The inspection revealed that not only were the support columns compromised, but critical load-bearing walls had been built with inferior materials. The clinic was immediately evacuated, and patients were transferred to other facilities. As for the residential buildings, 10 of the 14 showed similar construction flaws. Thousands of residents had to be evacuated and temporarily relocated, while the government scrambled to find alternative housing. It was a logistical nightmare, and it strained the government's resources to the breaking point. But Traoré refused to cut corners or delay. Every evening, he reviewed progress reports, personally approving expenditures for temporary housing and demanding regular updates on the investigation. He visited evacuation centers, speaking with displaced families, listening to their frustrations, promising that justice would be served and that they would be compensated for their losses. In one particularly memorable visit to a temporary housing facility, an elderly man confronted Traoré angrily. "Captain, with respect, you have made us homeless. Yes, our building was dangerous, but we had nowhere else to go. Now we sleep on mats in a gymnasium. How is this better?" Traoré did not deflect or defend. He sat with the man and listened to his complaints in full. Then he responded with characteristic directness. "You are right that this is difficult. You are right that it is disruptive and uncomfortable, but consider the alternative. If we had done nothing, if we had left you in that building, you might have woken up one night with the ceiling collapsing on your family. Your children might have been crushed. Your wife might have been killed. I cannot allow that. I will not allow that. So yes, for now, you sleep on mats in a gymnasium, but you are alive. Your family is safe. And we are working as fast as we can to find permanent solutions." The man had no response to that. He nodded slowly, anger giving way to grudging acceptance. Around the room, other evacuees who had been watching the exchange quietly returned to their activities. They did not like the situation, but they understood the necessity. Chapter 8. The trial of Séverin Traoré and the corrupt inspector became a national sensation. The proceedings were televised, and millions of Burkinabe citizens watched as evidence was presented detailing the systematic fraud that had endangered so many lives. Traoré's defense lawyers argued that building codes in Burkina Faso were outdated and that their client had simply adapted to local market conditions. The prosecution, led by a brilliant young lawyer named Rasmata Sawadogo, demolished this argument. Third, the defendant did not adapt to market conditions, she declared. He committed fraud. He took money meant for concrete and steel and put it in his pocket. He bribed officials to ignore his crimes, and he did so knowing that people's lives depended on the structural integrity of his buildings. This is not a regulatory dispute. This is criminal negligence on a massive scale. The evidence was so overwhelming that the defense quickly shifted strategy, attempting to negotiate a plea deal. But Traoré had made clear to prosecutors that no leniency would be shown. The message had to be sent that corruption in construction would result in serious consequences. The court ultimately convicted both Traoré and the inspector. Traoré received 20 years in prison and was ordered to pay full restitution to all affected families. The inspector received 15 years. Their assets were seized to help fund compensation and reconstruction, but the trials were only one part of the government's response. Traoré also pushed through comprehensive reforms to the building inspection system. Every inspector now had to undergo enhanced training, including modules on structural engineering and materials science. Inspections would be conducted by teams rather than individuals, reducing opportunities for bribery. And most significantly, a new civilian oversight board was created, empowered to conduct random audits of construction sites and review inspector certifications. Aminata Konaté, true to Traoré's offer, became one of the first community safety advisors. She underwent training in what to observe and how to report concerns effectively. She walked through Bogodogo weekly, noting everything from cracks in buildings to unusual water pooling to changes in animal behavior. She recruited other elders to do the same in adjacent neighborhoods, creating an informal network of eyes and ears. Issouf, meanwhile, threw himself into his studies with renewed purpose. He knew that in 2 years, when he graduated, a position awaited him in the building safety office. He began attending extra lectures on structural analysis and materials testing. His professors, impressed by his dedication and his story, provided additional mentorship. One evening, Issouf sat with his grandmother in her courtyard, both of them watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. The evacuated apartment building had been demolished, and construction on a new, properly built structure had begun. The temporary housing facilities were gradually emptying as families found permanent homes. "Grandmother," Issouf said, "do you ever think about how different things would be if you had not reported what you saw? If you had thought it was nothing and stayed quiet?" Aminata considered the question. "I think about it often. Those families would still be in danger. The president would not have known about the corruption. The other buildings would still be standing, waiting to collapse. So many lives affected by one decision to speak up. You change the course of things now," Issouf said. "One person can make such a difference." "Not one person," Aminata corrected gently. "Many people. I observed. You reported." The liaison officer took it seriously. Colonel Sankara escalated it. President Traoré ordered action. The inspectors did their work honestly, many people each doing their part. That is how change happens, child. Not through heroes, but through citizens who care enough to act. It was a lesson Issouf would remember for the rest of his life. Years later, when he was a senior inspector overseeing major construction projects, he would tell the story of his grandmother and the birds to every new engineer he trained, emphasizing that safety depended not on individual brilliance, but on systemic vigilance and collective responsibility. Chapter 9. 6 months after the evacuations, President Traoré hosted a ceremony to commemorate what the media had begun calling the building safety reforms. The event took place at the site of the first evacuated apartment building in Bogodogo, which had been demolished and replaced with a new structure built to enhanced safety standards. The new building was a model of proper construction, solid concrete, proper steel reinforcement, quality materials throughout. It had been built by a reputable contractor under intense scrutiny from government inspectors and community observers. Every stage of construction had been documented and verified. It represented not just a place for families to live, but a symbol of the government's commitment to accountability. Aminata and Issouf were guests of honor, seated on the platform with Traoré and other officials. The 12 families who had been evacuated from the original building were there, many now living in the new structure. Community leaders from across Ouagadougou attended, along with international representatives interested in Burkina Faso's innovative approach to construction safety. Traoré's speech was characteristically direct and thoughtful. 6 months ago, we faced a crisis that revealed both a problem and a pathway forward. The problem was corruption in our construction industry, putting profit above human life. But the pathway was shown to us by an elderly woman who paid attention, who trusted her observations, who had the courage to speak, and by a system that was ready to listen and act. He gestured to Aminata. Madame Konate did not have engineering degrees or technical training. What she had was wisdom, attention to detail, and responsibility to her community. When she noticed that birds avoided a particular building, she did not dismiss it as meaningless. She recognized it as a warning and acted on that recognition. Her actions saved 12 families and set in motion reforms that have made all of Burkina Faso safer. The crowd applauded, and Aminata, still somewhat uncomfortable with public attention, nodded her acknowledgement. Traoré continued, "The reforms we have implemented go beyond just fixing buildings. We have changed how our government relates to our citizens. We have created channels for community knowledge to inform official action. We have insisted on transparency and accountability. We have shown that traditional wisdom and modern science can work together to protect people." He then announced additional initiatives. The government was funding a national database of all buildings, tracking their construction, inspection history, and safety status. A new scholarship program would support students from modest backgrounds who wanted to study engineering and architecture, with guaranteed government positions upon graduation. And perhaps most significantly, community safety advisor programs modeled on Aminata's role were being established in cities and towns across the country. "We are building a culture of safety," Traoré declared. "Not just safe buildings, but a society where every citizen feels responsible for the well-being of their neighbors, where people speak up when they see problems, where government officials respond promptly and honestly, where contractors know that cutting corners will result in serious consequences. This is the Burkina Faso we are creating together." After the official ceremony concluded, Traoré spent time walking through the new building with the families who would live there. He inspected their apartments, listened to their feedback, and answered their questions. He wanted them to feel confident in the structure, to know that it had been built with integrity. One mother, whose 3 children had been among those evacuated from the original building, approached Traoré with tears in her eyes. "Captain, when you ordered us to leave our homes that night, I was so angry. I thought you were overreacting, causing unnecessary trouble. Now I understand you saved my children's lives. How do I thank someone for that?" "You thank me by being a good citizen," Traoré replied. "Watch over your community. Speak up when you see problems. Raise your children to be responsible and caring. That is all the thanks I need." Chapter 10. As news of Burkina Faso's building safety reforms spread, other nations began taking notice. Delegations from neighboring countries visited to study the program. The African Union cited it as an example of innovative governance. International development organizations offered funding to expand the initiatives, but Traoré was cautious about accepting too much external support. He had seen how foreign aid could create dependencies and distort priorities. "We will accept technical assistance and knowledge sharing," he told his advisors, "but the funding and control must remain Burkinabe. This is our program, addressing our needs based on our values. We cannot outsource that." The Community Safety Advisor program, in particular, attracted international attention. The idea of integrating traditional environmental knowledge into modern safety systems was novel, and early results were impressive. In the first 6 months, community advisors across Burkina Faso reported over 300 potential safety issues, ranging from weakened bridges to contaminated water sources to unstable hillsides. Not all reports led to major interventions, but enough did to validate the approach. One particularly notable success came from the city of Bobo Dioulasso, where a community advisor noticed that termites were avoiding a particular area of ground. Investigation revealed an underground fuel leak from an old storage tank. potentially explosive and contaminating groundwater. The leak was repaired before it could cause harm, and the advisor was credited with preventing both an environmental disaster and possible loss of life. These successes reinforced Traoré's conviction that governance worked best when it combined multiple forms of knowledge and engaged citizens as active participants rather than passive recipients. In speeches and interviews, he frequently referenced Aminata's story as proof that wisdom could come from anywhere, and that leaders had to listen to all voices, especially those traditionally marginalized. Meanwhile, the prosecution of construction corruption continued. Investigators discovered that Traoré's company was not the only one cutting corners. Several other contractors had engaged in similar practices, though perhaps not as extensively. Additional arrests followed. Some defendants, hoping for leniency, cooperated with investigators and revealed broader networks of corruption involving building material suppliers, government officials, and even some bank executives who had knowingly financed fraudulent projects. The corruption trials became a weekly drama, followed by millions of Burkinabe citizens. Some defendants showed remorse, others defiance, but all faced serious consequences. Traoré made clear that while he believed in rehabilitation and second chances for many crimes, endangering public safety through greed and negligence would be punished severely. The families affected by the evacuations gradually found stability. Some moved into the newly constructed replacement buildings, others received compensation that allowed them to purchase or rent homes elsewhere. A few started small businesses with their compensation money, turning crisis into opportunity. The government's commitment to making people whole, despite the enormous expense, built trust and demonstrated that accountability worked in both directions. Citizens had responsibilities, but so did the state. Aminata continued her work as a community advisor, now training others in what to observe and how to report. She developed a simple manual, written in accessible language that community members could use as a guide. The manual included sections on structural warning signs, environmental indicators, and unusual animal behavior. It became required reading for all new safety advisors across the country. Yusuf excelled in his studies, earning top marks in structural engineering. He began an internship with the Government Building Safety Office while still completing his degree, working alongside Chief Inspector Ouedraogo. The veteran inspector took Yusuf under his wing, sharing decades of experience and wisdom. Their partnership symbolized the bridging of generations and the integration of different forms of knowledge that characterized the new approach to safety. Chapter 11. 2 years after the initial evacuations, significant progress was visible across Burkina Faso. The building safety database was fully operational, with information on over 50,000 structures. The Community Safety Advisor Network had grown to include more than 200 trained observers in cities and towns nationwide. The scholarship program for engineering students had awarded its first grants, with 20 young people from modest backgrounds beginning their studies, but challenges remained. The construction industry, while cleaner than before, still struggled with quality control issues. Some contractors tried to find new ways to cut corners without getting caught. Inspectors occasionally missed problems. And the rapid urbanization of Ouagadougou and other cities created constant pressure for faster, cheaper construction. Traoré understood that lasting change required constant vigilance. In a meeting with his infrastructure team, he emphasized this reality. What we have achieved is important, but it is not permanent. Systems decay without attention. People forget lessons without reminders. We must remain committed to safety, transparency, and accountability, not just for months or years, but for generations. One area that particularly concerned him was rural construction. While urban buildings now received significant scrutiny, rural areas often built with minimal oversight. Traditional construction methods were generally sound, but the introduction of modern materials like concrete and steel without proper knowledge created new risks. The government began extending safety advisor training to rural communities, adapting the program to address local building practices and needs. Aminata, now 75, remained active in her community work. Her eyesight was not what it once was, but her attention to detail remained sharp. She had trained 3 younger women to assist her, passing on both her technical knowledge and her philosophy of careful observation and responsible action. These women, all respected community members with families and other responsibilities, made safety awareness a natural part of their daily routines. One afternoon, Aminata received an unexpected visitor. A journalist from France, working on a documentary about innovative governance in Africa, wanted to interview her about the building safety reforms. Initially reluctant, Aminata agreed after checking with Issouf, who encouraged her to share her story with an international audience. The interview took place in her courtyard, the same space where she had first noticed the birds avoiding the apartment building. The journalist, a woman named Sophie, asked thoughtful questions about Aminata's observations, her decision to report, and her current work. "What would you say to people who think bird behavior is superstition, not science?" Sophie asked. Aminata smiled. "I would say they are wrong. Birds are sensitive to vibrations, to sounds, to subtle movements that humans cannot detect. This is not magic, it is biology. Our ancestors understood this because they paid attention to nature. Modern people often ignore these signals because they trust only instruments and official experts. But instruments can be fooled, and experts can be bribed. Nature tells the truth. You have become somewhat famous because of this story," Sophie noted. "How has that changed your life?" "It has not changed my life much at all," Aminata replied honestly. "I still live in the same house, walk the same streets, know the same neighbors. I have a little more responsibility now, training others and making reports. But fundamentally, I am still an old woman who watches and cares about her community. The fame is not important. The work is what matters." The documentary, when it aired several months later, helped spread awareness of Burkina Faso's safety reforms internationally. Other African nations began implementing similar programs. A regional conference on community-based safety monitoring was held in Ouagadougou, attended by delegations from 12 countries. Aminata was invited to speak, and though nervous about addressing such a distinguished audience, she delivered a simple, powerful message about the importance of listening to all voices and valuing all forms of knowledge. Chapter 12. 3 years after the birds first avoided the apartment building roof, Issouf graduated from the Technical Institute with honors. He had completed his degree in civil engineering and accumulated significant practical experience through his internship. True to President Traoré's promise, a position awaited him in the government building safety office. The graduation ceremony was attended by his entire family, with Aminata seated in the front row, beaming with pride. Chief Inspector Traoré also attended, along with several other officials who had worked with Issouf during his training. After the ceremony, a small reception was held where Traoré himself appeared, having made time in his demanding schedule to personally congratulate the young engineer. "Issouf, your grandmother started something remarkable when she reported her observations," Traoré said, "but you are the one who will carry this work into the future. Buildings you inspect and approve will stand for decades. Engineers you train will design structures that serve our nation for generations. This is important work, and I am confident you will perform it with integrity and skill." "Thank you, Captain," Issouf replied. "I will do my best to honor the trust you have placed in me and to uphold the standards my grandmother helped establish." "Your best will be more than enough," Traoré assured him. "And remember, when in doubt, ask yourself what your grandmother would do. That instinct for careful observation and responsible action will serve you well." Issouf began his official position the following week. His first major assignment was to help develop a new training curriculum for construction inspectors, incorporating lessons learned from the building safety reforms. He worked closely with Traoré and other experienced inspectors, but also consulted with community safety advisors, including his grandmother, ensuring that traditional knowledge was fully integrated into the program. The curriculum they developed became a model for the region. It emphasized not just technical knowledge, but also ethics, communication skills, and the importance of listening to community concerns. Inspectors were trained to recognize warning signs from multiple sources: instruments, visual assessment, and environmental indicators including animal behavior. Aminata, meanwhile, gradually reduced her active safety advisor duties as age caught up with her. But she remained involved in training new advisors, her courtyard becoming an informal classroom where she shared stories and wisdom. Young people from across Ouagadougou sought her out, wanting to learn from the woman who had saved 12 families and sparked a national movement. On the 4th anniversary of the evacuations, A commemoration was held at the site of the original apartment building. The replacement structure was now fully occupied and had become a symbol of proper construction and government accountability. A plaque was installed at the entrance, reading, "This building stands on the site where 12 families were saved by the careful observations of Aminata Konaté and the decisive action of President Ibrahim Traoré. It reminds us that safety requires vigilance from all citizens and responsiveness from all leaders. May we always listen, always watch, and always act to protect one another." At the ceremony, Traoré reflected on what the past 4 years had taught him about governance and leadership. "When I ordered the evacuation of that building based on bird behavior, some thought I was foolish. When I promised to reform our entire construction safety system, some thought it was impossible. But we proved that when citizens and government work together, when we value all forms of knowledge, when we insist on accountability, significant change is possible." He looked at Aminata, seated nearby with Issouf at her side. "Madame Konaté, you taught us all an important lesson. You taught us that every citizen has the power to make a difference. You taught us that wisdom comes in many forms. You taught us that speaking up, even when you are uncertain, even when you fear being dismissed, is an act of courage that can save lives. On behalf of all of Burkina Faso, thank you." The crowd applauded, and Aminata stood slowly, acknowledging the recognition with her characteristic humility. She had never sought fame or honor, only to do what was right. But standing there, surrounded by families who were alive because she had paid attention and spoken up, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. That evening, back in her courtyard, Aminata sat with Issouf, watching the sunset one more time. The rebuilt apartment building stood across the street, lights glowing in windows, the sounds of family life drifting on the air. Birds perched comfortably on the roof, their presence a silent testament to the structure's integrity. "Grandmother," Issouf said quietly, "you changed the world." Aminata shook her head gently. "I watched birds, child, that is all. The world changed because people listened and acted. That is the real lesson. Not that one person can change everything, but that when many people each do their part, observing, reporting, investigating, deciding, building, change becomes inevitable." She paused, then added, "And perhaps that is the most important thing of all. Not heroes, but citizens. Not one great leader, but a society where everyone takes responsibility. That is how nations become strong. That is how people become safe." Issouf nodded, understanding. He would carry these lessons throughout his career, applying them to every building he inspected, every decision he made, every young engineer he trained. The story of his grandmother and the birds would become legendary in Burkina Faso's building safety community, told and retold as a reminder of why their work mattered and how wisdom could come from unexpected sources. As night fell over Ouagadougou, the city lights illuminated buildings of all kinds, some old, some new, all now subject to greater scrutiny and care than ever before. In neighborhoods across the city, community safety advisors went about their quiet work of observing and protecting. In government offices, inspectors reviewed building plans with meticulous attention. And in a modest courtyard in Ouagadougou, an elderly woman who had started it all sat peacefully, knowing that she had done her duty and that others would carry the work forward. The birds, oblivious to the human drama they had helped prevent, settled on rooftops for the night, choosing their perches with the ancient wisdom that had served their kind for millennia. And in doing so, they continued their silent work as guardians and guides, if only humans paid enough attention to listen.